Ulysses, Part 3, Nostos, Episode 13, Nausicaa. The time is about 8 p.m. The scene is rocks. In this case, we're back on Sandymount strand, where we had been earlier. The colour is grey. The technique is Tuescence, Detumescence, and retrogressive progression. Correspondences include Star of the Sea for Phaescia, Gerty being Nausicaa, and of course we have Ulysses back as always. The science or art is painting. The meaning is the projected mirage. Organ is the eye or nose, and symbols include Onanism, female, virgin, and hypocrisy. Other characters also include Cissy Caffrey and Edy Boardman. Plot. The summer evening had begun to fold the world into its mysterious embrace. Part 1. It's a lovely night out, a great night for a walk with the kids you look after. So that's just what Gerty McDowell, Edy Boardman and Cissy Caffrey do. As we look to them, we focus on Gerty, girlish Gerty, a pretty young woman who appreciates fashion, beauty and the finer things. She idles about being married or with a lover. She spots that she's being watched and, dare we say, she kind of likes it. The fireworks go off and they make their way off for the night. Part 2. A church service continues, the choir singing, the congregants responding, all as the church would hope. Part 3. Bloom here, watching. Him all along, being himself. What about where Molly and Millie are this weather? Nasty business at Kiernan's pub. Glad to talk to Mrs. Dignam. Poor Gerty was lame, so she was. He hadn't realised. Well, he's still wet now after his, what do you call it? Self-pollution. Sweets of Raoul for the peeping Tom. Not think of the other fellow, though. Cuckoo. Why have women such eyes of witchery? Gertie's were of the bluest Irish blue, set off by lustrous lashes and dark expressive brows. Time was when those brows were not so silkily seductive. It was Madame Vera, Verity, directress of the Woman Beautiful page of the Princess Novelette, who had first advised her to try eyebrow line, which gave her that haunting expression of the eyes, so becoming in leaders of fashion, and she had never regretted it. And then a rocket sprang and bang shot, blink, blind, blank, and oh! And then the Roman candle burst, and it was like a sigh of oh! And everyone cried oh! Oh! in raptures, and it gushed out of it, a stream of rain gold hair threads, and they shed, and they were all green, dewy stars falling with the golden. Oh, so lovely. Oh, soft, sweet, soft. Mr. Bloom watched her as she limped away. Poor girl. That's why she's left on the shelf and the others did a sprint. Thought something was wrong by the cut of her jib. Jilted beauty. A defect is 10 times worse than a woman, but it makes him polite. What on earth was that? The first part reads like a romantic novel, utterly unlike any of the other narratives he has in the novel. It's flat and florid, if that isn't some kind of contradiction, and centred mostly on a rather one-dimensional perspective of a woman who is practically a fantasy for the whole of the description of her. With an investigation of a church service going on in between, we then suddenly jump into the stream of consciousness of Leopold Bloom, and which is much more like what we're used to. It's an effect. It's a jarring effect, and it's about as jarring as that rather saccharine example of what Gerty is meant to be. The first part always reminds me particularly of the James Bond novel, The Spy Who Loved Me, one that Fleming himself disavowed. It's the one where we follow a woman's perspective. And then at the very end, in comes the hero, so to speak, James Bond, who quietly and quickly dispatches of the villains. And, Now, that awkwardness and awfulness may actually be a clue. Not that Bloom is a secret agent, but rather in his voyeurism he's creating a fantasy, a boy's own romance novel to accompany his, let's call it, fidgeting as he looks at her. It is the male gaze that we are seeing here. Now, is this a deliberate examination of the male gaze, or is it literally just Joyce's fantasy? It's hard to say. Joyce hasn't given much space over in the novel prior to this to the women that he talks about. And we know from his letters, if nothing else, that he is, let's say, sexually obsessed. But later on, with his writing of Molly, we get a sense that he can write a woman to some degree. And then there's this jarring back and forth from and to the novel that we know. It suggests that it isn't an accident. He isn't writing in the same style. It's a very different kind of world that he's describing now. It's difficult in our contemporary world to see this hero who's never quite allowed his opportunity for transcendence to start off on the far end of what we, at least today, considered publicly to be a transgression. Joyce was committed to a warts and all portrayal of Bloom, and with the focus and forgiveness on these warts. Some people suggest that Bloom imagined the whole of the presence of Gerty and that nothing is there. It's just a thing he conjured in his mind to get him to where he needed to go. Others will say that he can be forgiven for it, as it's not a direct act between him and her. You need to decide that for yourself as reader. Before I skip on, because that's plenty almost in itself, there are a couple of things I do want to touch on briefly, unlike Bloom, who touches on something quite a lot. There are echoes of other Joyce works here. Particularly loudest are the echo of the dead I find at the beginning. Every time I read the opening words of the chapter, I think of the dead, which in itself is a romantic story, albeit one that doesn't have the kind of romantic ending you expect. The first paragraph reminds me a lot of the last paragraph of the dead. And the baby chat and the talk with the baby also echoes a little bit of the beginning of A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. We can also ask questions about the combination of these friends. Are they like Chekhov's three sisters, or maybe the weird sisters of Macbeth, or perhaps they're the Fates? It's like that with a lot of Joyce. It's kind of what you want it to be. I've seen it said when I was researching different interpretations of this chapter that the presence of an aroused woman, a stranger, and a bat is a hint that Joyce is talking about Dracula by fellow Dubliner Bram Stoker. But honestly, there's so much stuff in this you can find your own meaning. I would always say, let the book reward your thoughts and your thinkings and insights, or, just the pleasure of reading it. Rather than rely on me or any Joycean scholar, it's a book that you read for yourself. I think that's important. So, how you feel about Bloom at the end of this novel, that speaks of you. And that's good. Let the novel read you as you read it.
And long, still to what that twilight comes love's old song, and long